Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening. Welcome to EIG's 24th webinar on new product introduction and development, taking on risk to generate speed. This is the second in the series of webinar in this series. Our first webinar focused on building a foundation of planning, communication, and execution basics. Again, this is the 24th in the series of webinars that EIG has launched and put on the internet here. And we continue to grow in our webinars, and we have webinars weekly. But we really appreciate you taking the time, especially in light of the coronavirus pandemic, the restrictions that are out there. We hope that your family is healthy and safe as we turn the tide here on the coronavirus. The focus of today's webinar is on risk, which is always generally about mitigation and reduction. However, today we're going to look at it from a little bit different perspective, and that perspective is risk appetite. This can help increase the speed of new products and services to the marketplace. Therefore, managing and or maximizing risk appetite leverages risk to generate speed. The COVID-19 vaccine development actually is an excellent example of the benefits of rational risk-taking. Our webinar addresses how these proactive NPI risk strategy can be embedded in your processes to speed up the development of your new products and services. We look forward to an interactive webinar. And please do log in to polev.com, Jim /Jim DeVries 073. And just to introduce myself, I'm Jim DeVries, founder and president of Enhance International Group. We're a platform of about 40 consultants, consulting companies, and SaaS providers that are dedicated to empowering your organization's workforce to expand and sustain your organization. Our goal is to provide collective, collaborative, experienced thought leadership to enable organizations to deliver self-sustaining positive margin growth. The competitive advantage focusing on 90-day action plans. We thrive on delivering 1 + 1 + 1 is infinity. So with that, just to give you a little background on EIG in our webinars, we have the webinars divided into 3 major categories: people, process, and technology. In process, we've focused on rapid skills development. In process, we've focused on everything from supply chain risk and resiliency to new product introduction to innovation. And in technology, we've focused on how to create a visible, resilient enterprise. And we've also looked at artificial intelligence. We've had a few fireside chats, and we hope to have a few more coming soon. And again, as we kick off here, please do join us with polev, Jim DeVries 073, and for the polling questions. Before we get started, I just want to introduce our 2 main presenters today, Dr. Phil Samuel and Dr. Mark Sneeringer. Phil, a few words?
Sure. I am Phil Samuel. I'm an expert in innovation strategy and operational excellence. I'm very fortunate to have participated in the launch of several hundreds of new products and services. Glad to be with you.
Thanks, Phil. Mark?
Yeah, I'm Mark Sneeringer. Been doing continuous improvement consulting since I retired as the continuous improvement leader for Philips Healthcare about 5 years ago. And before that, have been involved in improvement operations and efforts probably for the last, say, 20, 25 years.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Phil. Fantastic panel here to guide us through taking on risk to generate speed. With that, Mark?
Yeah, so as Jim was saying, today we're going to tackle a topic that rarely gets attention and may seem counterintuitive to some of us. Generally, when people consider risk, they're trying to reduce or mitigate it. We're going to talk about actually adding risk to a new product or service introduction in order to gain time. This may seem backwards thinking, but it's a rational way to decrease your time to market. We're all living through that, as Jim said, an excellent example of this rational risk-taking, the development of the COVID-19 vaccines. We'll use that case as we go through the actions that we're going to talk about as a good example of it. So this webinar builds on the NPI Speed Foundation that we presented during the session back in January. That can be found on EIG's site along with all the webinars presented over the last year. We have 2 more sessions coming up in April and May that also address speed, but today we're going to talk about rational risk-taking. So we look forward to your questions and comments. You can add those to the chat at any time. We'll try to answer them as we go along, but we'll definitely be covering them at the end of our presentation. So our agenda today starts with a definition of risk and risk appetite, followed by 3 areas where we see where rational risk can help shorten NPI programs: shortening individual tasks within the project, breaking timing dependencies between tasks, and using data to understand and justify risk. We'll wrap up at the end with some takeaways and the Q&A. So Jim, over to you.
Thanks, Mark. So we're going to kick it off again here with defining risk and how it impacts NPI speed. And we're going to then get into later those 3 areas that Mark just described. All right, so we all remember back when they were building structures like this and sitting out and having a nice lunch. So what is risk? Risk to them, risk to us. So traditionally, we've been looking at risk in 3 different perspectives, and this borrows from the reliability and Lean Six Sigma and even Design for Six Sigma tool, the failure modes and effect analysis, FMEA. And the first one is probability. And what is the probability that a risk turns into a failure within the development of a product or service? And, you know, this can be a problematic element of risk to estimate, because without test data or with the product subsystem already built or having experience, it's very difficult. Simulations can take place that can be used. And one of those is VARTRAN, Variation Transmission Analysis, has been around by Taylor for the last 20 or so years. It's an excellent tool to start looking at estimating the probability. And again, risk is the possibility of something bad happening. The second is impact. How impactful will the failure be if it occurs? So for example, will the product keep functioning and keep working and at a reduced mode or reduced level? Or do you have to turn it off? Do you have enough time to turn it off in a safe mode? Or will it just disrupt into something and cause a failure? Or could it be a loss of life? So for every different business or different product that you're making, that impact needs to be looked at and defined for that product line in its application to the end consumer. The third is visibility. How visible is the cause and effect failure when it occurs? So is it sufficient warning? Do you have a sufficient warning? So an engine light is the typical example of visibility. And time, closer you're able to identify it at the cause level, the better off you are. So generally, when we used to do projects, visibility was often ignored in quite a number of designs. And with the advent of the technologies now, we're seeing a lot more opportunities to see visibility in product designs. So we're seeing that as the three different things that can be driven. And again, you need to define this within your organization. Typically, we teach the 1 through 10 scale, and every one of those numbers, 1 through 10, should be clearly defined for your product and or business application. And those all three roll up into what we call the risk priority number, which is a multiplication of those three different values, and is rated for each failure scenario that you could occur for your product. So performing this on your project plan as you move through alpha and beta, it's good, as well as when it goes out into the field. And then the last is your risk plan. What are the responses or contingency for high priority or high impact items? So this is your risk plan, which is generally the right side of the FMEA, which often we don't spend enough time on because it tends to be tedious and laborious. But this is where time is money. In spending this time and making this a live document, it becomes a very good tool to help you manage your risk and understand what your risk is, so you can assess it and see it at the cause level all the way to your failure mode. So with that, I'm going to move to Phil. Phil, on the risk responses.
After you have identified the risks and analyzed the risk, you have a risk mitigation strategy. In fact, there are 4 risk mitigation strategies. The first strategy is risk avoidance. The second is risk mitigation. Third is risk transfer. And the last is risk acceptance. Risk avoidance strategy, we try to completely eliminate the risk by employing a redesign, change of concept, change of scope, etc., so that we can attack the risk opportunities. The second strategy is called a risk mitigation. In the risk mitigation strategy, we take actions to reduce the risk. The goal is to reduce high occurrence and high severity values by using known methods and controls, such as theory of inventive problem solving, etc. In this approach, risks are reduced but not eliminated. The third strategy is to use what is known as risk transfer. In this approach, we move the risk actions to someone else or to another phase or even to another project. The residual risk in this approach is 0, at least for now. You transfer the risk over to someone somewhere else. The last strategy or possible strategy is what we call acceptance strategy. In here, we live with the risk. And in fact, this is the topic of this webinar. So we want to figure out how can we accelerate the NPI, the new product introduction, while managing the risks through an acceptance strategy, something that is not frequently talked about.
Okay, so once the risk has been assessed and a decision made about what to do about it, there are 2 main courses of actions. First is mitigation, which attempts to reduce the risk through actions that change the probability or the visibility that it'll occur or to make the problem more visible. Think of car tire pressure. Checking your pressure regularly reduces the probability of getting a flat. Buying a car with a tire pressure indicator makes it more visible. So both of those would be mitigations. In our little illustration here, similarly, propping up the building so it doesn't fall over would be a mitigation. So the second one, though, is contingencies, and contingency plans lay out what actions you want to take if the issue does occur. Most businesses have disaster recovery plans, especially now after the shock that followed the start of the current pandemic. You hope you never need to take the actions, but you're prepared. Contingency plans are necessary for 3 of the risk responses that Phil talked about. Whether you plan to mitigate the risk, transfer it, or accept it, contingency plans should be made. So in the case of our building that we had propped up, the contingency plan would be to have a tent somewhere nearby that we could use in case the building did fall down. So then on the next slide, what we're going to talk about is what are the risk categories in a new product or a service introduction. And in a new product or service introduction risks, they can be broken down into a few categories. So by using these groupings when you're doing your project risk assessment, helps organize your inputs and makes all areas of risk visible or get considered when you're doing the assessment. These categories can also be used to identify opportunities for rational risk taking. So timing risks deal with issues that could knock a project off schedule. Time is also the main benefit that will be derived from the risk taking that you described today. Performance risks cover both outright failures of the product or service or the inability of the product to operate at the desired level. Think, for instance, of a new car that doesn't get the expected range between battery chargings. Taking performance risk is a key way to decrease time to market. Lack of resources also adds risk to an NPI project. People, equipment, funds, or materials aren't available when you need them. So the risk taking in this situation means proceeding despite the lack of those resources. And finally, cost overruns are a big risk to a successful product or process introduction. The project might cost too much to recoup the investment that you're making, or the unit cost might be too high to make a profit. Here, the risk taking is that extra cost can be made up by getting the product to the market faster. Phil, over to you.
Thank you. The success of every product or service launch is highly dependent on the business model behind it. So that begs the question, what is a business model? A business model describes 4 things. The value proposition, as described by the 3 blocks in the middle of the picture. The value creation, as described by the 3 blocks on the left side in blue. How the value is delivered, again 3 blocks that's in yellow to the right side of the image, and how the value is captured, that's the green at the bottom. So there are 4 themes in a business model: the value proposition, the value creation, value delivery, and the value capture. So in the context of a new product introduction, we have to ask the question, where are the risks embedded in the business model? How do we accept it? How do we handle it? Professor Gassman and colleagues at St. Gallen University in Switzerland have studied thousands of companies and mapped all of them into 55 known business model patterns. We won't have time to go through them, but as an example, freemium or multi-sided platform are 2 examples of such business model platform pattern. In freemium, the basic version of an offering is given away for free in the hope of eventually persuading the customers to pay for the premium version. An example of freemium is the free version of LinkedIn versus the premium version of LinkedIn. What's interesting in the context of new products and services launch is that we must understand the business model and ask the question about the risk appetites. So we will discuss in the next few slides the risk appetites, its context, and how that affects new product launch. Jim?
Thanks, Phil. As Phil said, we'll come right back to these 55 business models as it relates to this risk appetite. But first, what is risk appetite? The classic definition is that it's the amount of risks that an organization is willing to pursue or retain. This drives the risk appetite of the organization. Some companies are more pragmatic, while others are more conservative. And still others like to manage their risk, and some like to maximize those risks. And it may sound counterintuitive, but there are companies out there that are looking at risk as an opportunity to differentiate themselves among the competition. In the high-tech areas, you'll see a lot of this in the used as a competitive weapon against the competition. Amazon and Google definitely do this on a regular basis. Traditionally, the heavy industries, life sciences industries, have been burdened with product liability lawsuits, and then tend to end up being more pragmatist or conservators. So these folks are, because of these lawsuits, their risk appetite is less. They tend to be averse to risk because it's a matter of survival to avert the risk and not try to take it on head on. The example here about airline engine shutdown versus lost baggage is there just to show that your appetite for risk as a passenger is much different for an engine shutting down versus lost baggage. So now we're going to get back into the business models. And then the first business model we'll look at is first to market, where you accept some kind of performance loss and the product is launched with known bugs. So we see this a lot in the high-tech industry. Right now, the Samsung and Apple are coming out with foldable phones. The screens can fold. And if you look at that type of approach, they know that it may fail and they're going to have some field failures, but to be second to market is not a very good thing for them because they know that whoever's first to market garners 80% of the market share. So as foldable phones become a mainstay, as they were in the late 1990s with Motorola, everybody was trying to come up with that next phone. So Motorola back in the 90s had a very high quality, which brings us to the second business model. They built a flip phone that was very high quality. It was, maybe late into the market, but the quality was always there. You could throw those cell phones off the 4-story building and they still work. And so what happened is the business model for cell phones changed from high quality to first to market. And Motorola has never really recovered from that, even when they tried to launch the Moto back a few years ago. The next business model is luxury brand, and that is around producer's cost. So in a luxury brand, you're willing to take on additional cost internally to manufacture cars like a Ferrari or a Lamborghini or even a Rolls Royce or a Volvo or a Land Rover or a BMW. So you price above the market, you know that, and you transfer that cost out to the customer. And then another business model is catch up, where you're always catching up with the competition. And an example of that is what we saw in the lighting business as we move from fluorescent to incandescent to fluorescent to now LEDs. So we saw the big light makers, Philips and GE, falling behind the LED makers. And then when they try to catch up, of course, they accept that they're going to have increased cost coming up at a later time. So Phil and Mark, do you have some additional examples to share?
I think, Jim, we can, keep talking and extend this to all other 50 plus business models. But the point is that when we do launch, we got to not only examine just the product features and its reliability and its performance, we should examine the business model that we will use to launch the product. So in the luxury brand example, Jim, you used the Rolls-Royce example. the core part of the business. So if you think about the value proposition, they have a high luxury offering, high end, and they're looking at low volume but high price, high margin. So which enable them to afford in the value creation bucket expensive resources. And however, in that case, it didn't quite work out for them several times. One time, the UK government had to bail them out because they have high cost structure, but they could balance it with the high price, and it just didn't quite work out several times for them. So we have to, when you accept the risk, you have to also ask the question of what aspects of the business model risk are we willing to accept, and how do you manage them?
Thanks, Phil. Excellent. So as Phil said, we could talk for an hour on that one slide in those 55. But as we move forward here, we asked you to answer the first survey question, which is for your new product development cycle for your company, how has COVID-19 pandemic changed your development risk in your business? Are you taking on higher risk, much higher, lower risk, or much lower, or about the same? You haven't really changed the way that you look at building your new products. So I ask you to answer. We're getting really good feedback, so we'll show the responses right away. Everybody, it looks like the majority of people are saying they haven't changed a whole lot, and a few have said they're taking higher risk. I welcome Mark and Phil to add your comments here, please.
Yeah, I think it depends a lot on the industry and the business model that you're working in as to whether or not this shock that we're going through with the pandemic changes your risk profile or your risk appetite on especially on new product introduction.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for participating. There will be a few more polls. Appreciate it. Okay, so now that we have a clearer picture of what risk and risk appetite are, it's time to look at the first group of opportunities to increase speed by taking on risk. Shortening tasks that are on the project's critical path will shorten the overall project timeline. So I remember the first time I saw the quote, "Perfect is the enemy of good." I didn't like it. Why would anyone strive for just good when perfect is better? As I spent more time working on projects with deadlines, though, I came to understand the wisdom of doing what is necessary as opposed to doing what's possible. So development tasks like building prototypes and test units or testing those units can be shortened by accepting a broader confidence interval. The confidence interval is the statistical range of a metric that contains the true value of the population. If you're willing to be less certain about that range, you can reduce the sample number and accept a larger risk that is the true result, where the true result may lie too far from your target. So if you take this opportunity for speed, it's also worthwhile to have some sort of contingency plan available. COVID vaccine development is a good example of accepting a broader confidence interval. They use smaller samples, faster testing, which gave them a larger confidence interval, but the speed was achieved by that by those samples and shorter studies. The contingency was that they were developing multiple options on parallel paths at the same time. So if certain ones failed, others would step in, and we've seen that in what's actually happened with COVID-19 vaccine development. So that's the first one. Now on this one, the quote on here, I liked it the first time I heard it. All models do differ from the actual situation by one degree or another. The value of the model is if it gives you useful information without having the model without having to actually build the entire product. Not all models do that. Models can be physical representations of the product or a feature of the product. More and more, they're digital representations of that actual product or service. The goal of the model is to prove a concept or feature before committing to full construction.
This allows increased speed and usually reduces costs. The risk you accept when using the model is that it doesn't truly represent the product. A concept that applies to both models and the final designs is listed here as constraints. These are the boundaries within which the model or the product is expected to perform without problems. By relaxing constraints, design issues get potentially easier and faster to solve. For instance, if you have a test where you drop a unit from a prescribed height and it has to be able to survive that drop, cutting that height in half. So maybe you drop, instead of dropping from 6 feet, you drop from 3 feet, which would be like if you kicked it off the side of a desk or something. That you cut it in half and it makes it easier to pass that test. So that's a way of actually playing with those constraints, is a way of actually speeding up the project as well. So the COVID example here is the in vitro testing of treatment and vaccine candidates. There's a risk that the chemistry that goes on in the glassware does not mimic what happens in the bodies. Once the testing moves to humans, a normal constraint that has to be dealt with is harmful side effects. So in the middle of the pandemic, I think there's more frequent occurrence of those side effects might be allowed in order to increase the speed to market to get us out of the pandemic.
When launching new products, one of the risk consideration is its performance over time. And this is called the reliability of the product. How do we test the reliability of a product when its mean time to failure is counted in years? We cannot afford to wait for many years to collect that data. And one way to deal with that issue is through accelerated life testing and accelerated stress screening. The goal of these tests is to excite the expected failure modes quickly so that we can understand and deal with that risk. The philosophy of accelerated life testing, or highly accelerated life testing, also known as HALT, is to generate more cycles of usage per unit of time. The philosophy of stress screening, on the other hand, is to place the product usage under more severe, stringent, difficult conditions. We then use scaling models to figure out the actual reliability of the product in real life conditions. Now, the danger of the approach is that a new failure mode may be introduced during the test. Modes that do not occur in normal product use may be seen during the test. So we have to have we have to be able to manage the accelerators to mimic the real usage conditions. In accelerated stress screening, the goal is to excite failure modes that are not evident under normal conditions. We can increase the stress, like pressure, temperature, humidity, and so forth, in steps until the product fails. Again, we need to assess the relevance of high stress failures and make sure that these are mimicking real life conditions. So while they are very useful, we have to be careful utilizing these models. One of the challenges with the data we collect is that we have early test results while we develop the product and get ready to launch them. And we often make the assumption that the performance we see from the early test results will continue to the product life target. And that's not always true. So there are risks in undiscovered or new failure modes that come out during the later part of the test if we were to continue it. So for example, faster wear out as the product ages. So somebody could take a compressor design that is normally used in air conditioners, and you can apply it to refrigerators. And later, years later, you might realize that there are some undiscovered catastrophic failures. Another example, as you can see from this image, is the brake pad delamination after half of the thickness is worn out. So in this context, we have to assess the probability and the impact of these new failure modes as and when we understand it. It's interesting that some of the early COVID-19 treatments that did not prove effective once more data was available. In the beginning, we thought it was effective, but once we started collecting more data, we realized that it was statistically speaking not significant.
So this brings us to the second polling question. Rank the options to shorten NPI task in the order you would consider acceptable risk. Looks like we already have some folks doing this. So Phil, you want to take over this? Run us through this?
So relying on the accelerated life and stress testing is a common strategy for NPI approach. And I think it's a well-known strategy. The question always comes to how good is your model. To just like Mark said, all models are wrong, but it is still better than having nothing. You have to, again, be careful for extrapolating, but they are both good strategies, well-known strategies, well-established strategies. So no surprise here. Mark, you have anything to add to it?
I find it interesting that accepting the broader confidence intervals came out as people's fourth choice, in that, you know, it says that even when you're trying to get to the speed, you want the accuracy, or you want the certainty that you're getting the results that you expect. And so I guess I'm not surprised by that, but I want folks to remember that is a way to speed things up.
Absolutely. And just to add to that, that's what variation transmission analysis does. It helps you in that when you're doing those analyses. And that's generally untapped in most designs. Okay, thanks everyone for participating. Looks like everybody's using the system quite well. Great, poll everywhere is working well. Thank you. So the next section here is breaking project dependencies. And we'll talk a little bit about soft and hard toll gates. And with that, we'll talk about a number of ways we can break dependencies, starting with early prototypes and product validation. Early prototypes for product validation, you know, you may not have the fit and finish, but the assessor does not have to accept that. So that's the risk, that they don't accept this type of prototype. However, it can be used, and it has been used for years. And a perfect example is the breadboard version for regulatory testing, because breadboards have been around for as long as I've been around, and probably even before. And there's little risk of transferring a breadboard into the final finished product. So early prototypes are a very good way to break a dependency. The next is models, mockups for user testing, control panels, computer interfaces. Again, the risk here is the user experience isn't what it was intended. And so the user may reject it just because the interface is not what they expected to see, whereas the basic functionality is working underneath. The next is a product feature requires future capabilities into products before they can be utilized. Adding components that are needed for future product generations, versions. And the risk here is the technology fails to work when called upon. So you're using that state-of-the-art technology. And the example that we show here is, it's very interesting. Tesla has added sensor arrays to support future self-driving cars. So even though the regulations have not got to the place where cars are self-driving, all Teslas are equipped so that when they switch over, those cars can still be used. So it's pretty interesting that they've done that. Moving along on breaking dependencies is, from a manufacturing perspective, is, looking at your tooling in your preliminary drawings and looking at the long lead time materials. And, you change your sunk or sink cost, and you balance your time and versus cost. So tooling is a very good area where you can focus to break some dependencies. Is start before final approvals, assuming that you don't have any late changes. The risk, of course, is you're going to have useless production, and you need to balance, of course, the customer schedule requirements versus the potential scrap that can be encountered. And the last example here that we're talking about is, again, going back to the vaccine, is that, as we all know, they all, Merck, Moderna, Pfizer, vaccines early, hoping that they will pass. Merck's didn't, so they failed. However, now that J&J did pass, and now they needed excess capacity, Merck was able to step in to help through the Defense Production Act. So these are all ways to break dependencies.
Another option to accept and manage the risk is to carry multiple potential solutions in parallel until we have to make a hard decision. This approach of delaying the selection of the preferred option as long as practical is a good way to manage the risk. It often results in better solutions. It avoids locking into a path that may not be optimal from a feasibility perspective. The risk is that it will use or utilize more resources, and you may have to carry the many costs to deal with it. The downside is the resource and the cost. An example for this is actually well illustrated in the development of iPhone. When the iPhone was developed, there were several discussions as to, should we use a tried and true approach that was actually based on the iPod design, or should we switch to the tablet model? And they have different risks. iPod is a less risk, but it is staying in the same paradigm. The touch tablet model would be much more severe risk, but you would have to shrink the Mac OS, much higher risk. And Steve Jobs, in a clever way, carried both teams to the extent possible until they had to make a hard decision. So it lowered the time it takes to launch in case one failed. It's done in parallel. So in the final decision was to go with the touch tablet, and that worked out well for the market. A great example of parallel paths and carrying the concept all the way forward until you really have to make a final decision. So that's one approach and a strategy to accept and manage the risk.
So the next concept is about phase gate discipline. and governance. As we know, toll gates are pretty important in the design for Six Sigma process or any NPI process that we have. And there's governance models out there that those deliverables you cannot go past the gate unless the deliverables are in full. And if there's a delay, you cannot pass that gate, meaning a hard toll gate. And there, the project team presents reasons for the missed deliverables, actions, and timing. But the risk here is you are not able to move on, and the items can't be closed, and your project's delayed and goes into a cost overrun. By moving to a soft toll gate, we want to shorten the project time, but how do we do that without increasing risk? And the way that we do that is we start focusing more on creating clear rules, proactive planning, risk mitigation, commitment for action plans, and a willingness to send the project back at a later time after the toll gate has been passed to address those particular items. So soft toll gates still have clear rules for what can be delayed and have those remedial actions. And they need to have a commitment for action plans to be completed on those open items. And there's a willingness to send that project back, as I just mentioned. So there is a strong need to clearly articulate those risks and benefits as we move to increase that visibility. Soft toll gates can be effective, but it all starts with visibility, and it ends up with the closure of agreed upon actions.
Okay, so the third area that we're going to explore is using data to better understand risk, and it's closely related to some of the actions that we've already described. So one way to speed up a project is consider the full distribution of outcomes instead of focusing on just the target. If you have a target minimum or a lower spec, the full distribution will tell you the probability of being outside that spec. We've been successful in applying this concept actually to the financial predictions regarding a product introduction by using ranges for inputs like market growth and product cost instead of single values. We've shown that the likelihood that the project will miss the target, we show what the likelihood is of the target missing the target profitability. So in the example that's shown here, the project would have an average ROI of like 15%, but there's also a 13% probability that the ROI will be below the target threshold of 10%. So you get a good idea of where you are, and when you're good enough, then you start talking about the acceptable performance, so that when you use this full variation and that confidence interval we talked about earlier, when that confidence interval falls within your specification, you've reached a target and you've got a product that's good enough to launch, and so you can move forward faster than if you were just looking at, say, average values or not taking into account these full distributions. Another way to do this on the next slide is to use data from previous projects to predict how long or how much effort the next project is going to need. A regression analysis of project time is a function of variables such as the number of drawings that are involved, the percentage of the product that you're touching, the amount of reliability testing that needs to be done. They can show which variables control the speed and can provide a predictive equation. While having that prediction in and of itself is important, the other thing is the fact that you know which variables are significant mean you can focus in on speeding them up and focus on shortening or maybe even eliminating activities that don't drive the project timeline. At a minimum, those variables that aren't significant in this equation should not be allowed to dictate what the critical path is. So this is successfully applied this to be able to predict how long the next project is going to take.
Thanks, Mark. And so that brings us to the last section, the wrap-up section of rational risk-taking, generating speed opportunities. And if you would, just keep your eye out on those 3 items above: shortening NPI tasks, breaking project dependencies, and using data to understand and justify risk. We'll be coming back and asking you a question about those in a few minutes. But just as a recap, risk appetite is driven by multiple factors. First, the potential cost versus expected benefit comparison. Second, the position in the market, first mover, category leader, or a catch-up. And the third, market dynamics, price sensitivity, speed, and innovation. Then we talked about risk categories, time, schedule slippage, taking longer than anticipated, turning into overruns. Performance is off the target from what we originally intended. Resources, people, materials, and equipment are not available when needed. Timing issue. And then the cost. The development cost is higher than we anticipated, or the deliverable cost per unit. So what is the difference between your planned and your actual in each of these risk categories? The last is achieving NPI speed through risk taking. And we talked about shortening tasks. Perfect is the enemy of good. Breaking dependencies. Start next before previous finished. In data analysis. So just think about those 3 as we move to this next and last polling question, is to what would be the best opportunity for business to generate speed through rational risk taking. So if you would answer the survey there, we will start showing your responses. Thank you so much for participating. Great feedback this webinar. We really appreciate it. Start showing some answers on what is resonating with all of you on the call. Utilize data to make decisions more quickly. Nice. A little bit about break dependencies. None. If you did say none, please do put your comments in the Q&A. That would be wonderful so we could better understand. Mark, Phil, any comments on this, on the feedback here?
I'm a little surprised by how big the bar is for the data versus the others. Favorite of mine is the breaking dependencies, where you can take a risk to start something sooner than you would in a normal sequence.
I guess it may be that they're already doing that today.
Could be.
They may feel that those are things that they're doing today and they're not doing enough of data. Maybe a way to interpret the feedback from the audience here.
Mm-hmm.
Phil, any comments?
Utilizing the data is actually not surprising, because we are or have already entered the age where collecting data is actually a lot easier and simpler. With the age of IoTs, AI, ML, all those strategies, it's easier to collect large quantities of data and make some quick insights analysis. And that is becoming more and more prevalent in the context of even for new product development.
Okay.
Great. All right. Thanks again for everyone. I think there's a comment in the chat. We'll grab that as Mark closes out the last slide here.
Jim, there is a question that says, are there situations where you would not take a risk to speed up your NPI project? Maybe Mark, you have some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to the risk assessment, and probably the thing that drives this most is impact. So when you have a very high impact, say that you've got life or limb on the line, or complete failure of the product, those are times when you wouldn't take on a risk to speed things up. You want to make sure you get those risks absolutely dealt with.
There is another question that says, do these concepts apply to non-manufacturing situations? So if it's a banking or a retail or some non-manufacturing industries, they're coming up with a new services or a new product. Would these concepts still be valid?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, in terms of a service development, I think you go through a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same, steps where you might have dependencies, or you need to make a decision. So making them on less information, or breaking those dependencies in that development of a service or a transactional process is, I think it would definitely apply there.
Yeah, in the IT industry, where you have a lot of SaaS solutions and services are generally attached to that, there are certainly all of these major categories certainly apply. And we could certainly follow up with you, whoever asked that question, in more detail, but there are definitely, we use these techniques.
Yeah, we may not be doing accelerated life testing, but we can do all kinds of simulations. So if it's a call center, for example, we could do easily process simulation. We can imagine a scenario where lots of calls coming in or less calls coming in, duration differences, and look at implications. We can create other kinds of simulations. They are easily applicable. Jim, we are almost out of time. You have any final thoughts and wrap up?
Close this out.
Yeah, I think so. Hopefully we've given the folks that are on the call a perspective on risk that will help generate new product or service development speed. We've talked about what those actions are for shortening projects. To do it, you need to understand your company's risk appetite and examine your new product process for opportunities. We would advise strongly that anything you do, you document, so that if you need to figure out what went wrong or what worked, you've got the things able to help you do that. And as we've got one last quote for you here from Louis Pasteur, and fortune really does favor the prepared mind. So good planning and stuff helps you when you're doing this risk taking. I want to thank everybody for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and just closing us out here. We have future webinars coming up next Wednesday. We have a webinar on supply chain risk and resiliency, and we'll talk about the maturity model. That's second in a series of webinars. We'll be soon returning to the rapid skills deployment webinar and the 90-day action plan series. We'll come back here and go to this digitization tools on April 7th, looking at how to increase speed and resiliency. And then in a few weeks, our artificial intelligence team will be looking at automations in computer vision and deep learning. And then lastly, we'll be looking at digital twins. We'll come back to that series at the end of this month. So again, thanks everyone for joining us. We appreciate your time today, and we hope you have a great week. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. And we look forward to seeing you again in the webinar soon. Phil, any closing remarks?
That's it. Look forward to the next sessions.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks. Mark, anything?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day.